The rain had not stopped for 3 days over Pyeongchang-dong, and by the third night, it had begun to sound like something more deliberate than weather. It fell in long, gray sheets against the slate roofs of the old villas at the foot of Bugaksan, gathered in the stone gutters of the Kim estate, and pooled in the crushed granite of the driveway where a black Bentley flying spur had not moved in 9 days. On the second floor, in a study that faced east toward a mountain, the man inside had stopped looking at. A silver compass sat on a low table of Korean pine. It was old, older than the estate, older than the man who had once owned it. Its glass was hair-lined in 3 places. Its needle no longer pointed north with any conviction. It rested on a folded square of white cotton, the way certain families in Andong still rested the spoons of their dead before a jesa, and nobody in the household but the man himself was permitted to touch it. It had been on that table for 11 years. He had not opened it in 9. 11 floors below the study, which is to say at ground level, because the phrase was a habit from his Cheongdam years, and had followed him here to the hills. Kim Sang-hoon sat in the wide kitchen of the mansion with the lights turned down and a small cup of Andong soju going warm in his hand. It was 11:19 p.m. on the 14th of November, a Thursday, and the grandfather clock in the front hall, a Japanese-made piece his father had bought during the last year of his life, and which nobody in the family had ever quite forgiven him for, was ticking the way it always ticked, patient and unimpressed. Kim was 41 that autumn. He had not eaten since a bowl of doenjang jjigae at 8, prepared by a housekeeper who had learned the recipe from his halmyeoni before his halmyeoni died. And he was thinking, as he sometimes did on nights when the rain would not stop, of a thing his mother had said to him at a table in Seongbuk-dong when he was 26 and certain of everything. She had said it while ladling stew. He had not listened. He set the cup down. He listened to the clock. He listened to the rain. He did not yet know that the compass upstairs had been waiting for this night for almost a decade, and that the person it had once belonged to had been dead for exactly 14 days. On paper, Kim Sang-hoon was the sort of man the Korean financial press wrote about in the language reserved for weather systems and inherited disasters. He was the third-generation head of the Seongjin Group's shipping and logistics arm, chairman of 2 subsidiary boards, principal signatory on a Singaporean holding vehicle that controlled port concessions in Busan, Incheon, and Labuan, and, since the previous spring, the discreet controlling interest behind a Jeju resort development that had made the local council quietly wealthy. He owned the Pyeongchang-dong estate outright, a 58th-floor apartment in Signil, Seoul that he had not slept in since March, a Yangpyeong farmhouse with a Korean pine floor his halmyeoni had chosen in 1994, and a Bentley he had stopped driving because it reminded him of a road in Gapyeong he no longer wished to remember. Last month he had signed a memorandum of understanding with a Zurich-registered maritime insurer whose lawyers had flown in on a Wednesday and flown out on a Thursday, and left behind a leather folio embossed with a coat of arms that meant nothing to anyone in the room. He had been engaged 7 years ago to a woman named Adaeze Okonkwo Kim, a Nigerian forensic accountant born in Enugu and educated at the London School of Economics, whose Igbo name meant daughter of a king, and whom his mother had loved on sight and his uncles had not. He was engaged now to no one. He was engaged, in the older Korean sense of the word, only to the house and the ledger and the compass upstairs, on paper. His mother had warned him 3 times. The first warning had come in the kitchen of the Seongbuk-dong house, the winter he turned 26, over a pot of samgyetang she had begun at dawn. She had lifted the lid, and the steam had risen between them in a slow column that smelled of ginseng and jujube and the particular sweetness of a chicken that had lived long enough to matter. And she had said, without looking at him, that a man who marries a woman his family will not name in the ancestral rites is a man who has already begun the work of losing her. She had ladled the broth. She had not repeated herself. The second warning had come the following autumn, at the wooden gate of the Yangpyeong farmhouse, when a daise had arrived for the first chuseok, with a small covered dish of jollof rice she had made because his mother had asked her to bring one thing from her own country to the ancestors' table. His mother had opened the gate herself, taken the dish in both hands with the small bow one gives to a guest carrying something sacred, and turned to her son with a glance that lasted no more than a second and contained in it a full sentence he had refused to read. The third warning had come across a low table in a Hanok tea house in Bukchon 3 days before the wedding, when his mother had set down her cup of miso cha and said quietly that a family which cannot bow to a daughter-in-law with her own name has no right to ask her to bear its children. He had smiled. He had told her she worried too much. He had been wrong. He did not yet know how wrong. At 11:47 that Thursday night, the intercom on the wall of the kitchen buzzed once, and then, before Kim could rise, buzzed twice more in the short-spaced rhythm his head of security used only for the front gate. He crossed the flagstones of the hall barefoot because he had begun, in the 9th year of the silence, to prefer the cold of the stone to the warmth of a slipper, and he stopped at the small monitor beside the door. The image on the screen was grainy from the rain. 3 figures stood beneath the stone lintel of the gatehouse. The tallest of them, a girl of perhaps 16, held the hands of 2 smaller boys, and none of the 3 was carrying an umbrella. They had been standing there, the timestamp on the lower right of the screen indicated, for 4 minutes. They had not rung the bell. They had, instead, walked from the gatehouse to the front door of the mansion itself. The guard had let them through, which was, in itself, a breach of protocol that Kim would not investigate until morning, and had knocked on the heavy wooden door 3 times, slowly, without urgency, the way one knocks on the door of a house one has already visited in a dream. The head of security's voice came through the speaker, careful and low. "There are 3 children outside, sir." Kim looked at the screen for 11 seconds. He said, "Open the door." He said it in the voice he used for boardrooms, which was to say he said it once and quietly and did not repeat himself. Then he walked the length of the hall himself, past the grandfather clock, past the low table where his father's photograph sat behind a small brass bowl of uncooked rice, and put his hand on the iron handle of a door he had not opened himself in almost a year. The door swung inward on its old brass hinges, and the rain came in first, and then the smell of wet wool, and then the 3 of them. The girl was tall for 16, with the long, straight bones of a swimmer and skin the color of wet earth after a storm. Her hair braided close to her scalp in 6 neat rows that had begun to loosen at the temples. She wore a navy school coat that had been mended once at the left cuff by a hand that knew what it was doing, and she carried a canvas backpack that had been reined through to the seams. The taller of the 2 boys, perhaps 10, held a small plastic bag containing what appeared to be a single change of dry clothes. The smallest, perhaps 7, held nothing at all, and he was holding nothing with the particular stillness of a child who has learned that hands which hold nothing cannot be accused of taking anything. The girl had been born in a hospital in Enugu State, Nigeria, on a Tuesday in April, and had been given by her birth mother the name Chiamaka, which means God is beautiful, and had been given later by the woman who became her mother in a coastal town in South Jola, the additional name Ha-un, which means grace of summer. She held, at that moment, in her right hand, the strap of the backpack, and in her left, the wet fingers of the 7-year-old, and she had lost 11 kilograms in the 2 months her mother had been ill. None of this was visible to Kim as he stood in the doorway. Only the fact of her and the 2 boys behind her and the rain running off the eaves of a house her mother had once described to her in the low voice used for stories that were not quite fairy tales, as beautiful and empty. She looked up at him. Her eyes did not move. "Are you Mr. Kim?" she asked, and her Korean was careful and unaccented, the Korean of a girl who had been taught by a woman who spoke it as an act of love. He nodded. She reached into the front pocket of the backpack, unzipped it with fingers that had gone white at the knuckles from the cold, and drew out a small object wrapped in a square of red silk. She unwrapped it in the doorway, in the rain, without hurrying. It was the silver compass. She held it out to him on the flat of her palm. "Our mother told us to give you this," she said, "if anything ever happened to her." That was the first quotable line, and it was spoken by a child in a doorway at 11:52 p.m. on the 14th of November. And Kim Sang-hoon, who had not been afraid of a room in 19 years, felt the blood leave his face. "Sit down," he said. He said it to himself, but the girl heard it, and she and the 2 boys stepped past him into the hall, and she sat down on the low bench beneath the grandfather clock, and the 2 boys sat on either side of her, and none of them spoke. And Kim, whose whole life had been a series of rooms he had entered knowing what would be said, sat down on the stone step of his own front door in the rain and did not know anything at all. If you are already feeling this, pause, take a breath, and hit subscribe to Korean Mafia Family. Tap the bell so the next chapter finds you the moment it drops. What is about to happen in the next 41 minutes of this story will unmake your understanding of what a family is in 3 places, and it will rebuild it with something quieter, harder, and far more human than what you walked in with. Stay. You are going to want to be in the room for what comes next, because the woman who is not in this house tonight is going to walk through it anyway, room by room, on the voice of a 16-year-old girl who has not yet cried in front of anyone. And when it is over, tell me one thing in the comments. What did your mother once say to you at a table that you did not listen to at the time? And how old were you when you finally understood she had been right? To understand what happened in that hall on the night of the 14th of November, you have to go back 9 years and 7 months, to a city that no longer exists in either of their memories the way it actually was. They met in the autumn of the year Kim turned 32, in a small forensic accountancy firm on the 8th floor of a building in Yeoksamdong that has since been torn down and replaced with a glass tower belonging to a bank. He had gone there on the instruction of an uncle who did not trust the numbers his own auditors were producing, and he had expected, in the way of men who had grown up with a household of women who deferred, to be met by a man in a gray suit. He had been met instead by Adaize Okonkwo, 29 years old, born in Enugu to a father who was a customs judge and a mother who taught mathematics at the university, educated in Lagos and then London, holder of a certification in forensic accounting from the ACFE and a second in international AML compliance, wearing a plain white blouse and a navy skirt, and the small gold cross her grandmother had given her at her confirmation in a cathedral in Onitsha. She had extended her hand. She had said, in Korean that was still, in that first year, careful and slightly formal, that she had reviewed the files and that his uncle was being stolen from, and that the thief was sitting 2 chairs to the uncle's left, at every board meeting, and that she could prove it in 11 days if he would let her. Kim had looked at her for a long moment. He had said in English that 11 days was too long. She had said in Korean that honest work took the time it took. He had hired her the same afternoon. He had married her 14 months later in a small ceremony at a hanok in Bukchon that his mother had arranged with her own hands, at which his uncles had sat in a row along the eastern wall with their faces composed and their hearts closed, and at which his halmioni, who was already dying and who would be dead by the following spring, had held Adayezi's hand for the length of a full song and had said in the old Andong dialect that Adayez did not yet understand but would learn to, that a granddaughter is a granddaughter whether she comes from your body or from the road. His halmioni had died in April of the following year at Severance Hospital on the 14th floor of a heart that had simply grown tired, and Adayez had sat with her through the last 2 nights and had learned from the night nurse how to fold the corner of the sheet in the way the old woman preferred, and had, on the morning of the funeral, stitched a small square of white cloth over the tear in the sleeve of Kim's morning hanbok, because there had been no one else awake to do it. Their son was born the following winter at Samsung Medical Center at 4:12 a.m. on a Tuesday in January. They named him Ji-hoon in Korean, which means one who is wise, and Chukwe Mecca in Igbo, which means God has done great things, and they wrote both names on the small wooden tag that hung above his cot in the Yangpyeong farmhouse, where Kim's halmioni had once chosen the pine floor. He lived for 11 months. He died on a Sunday in December of a congenital heart defect that no scan had caught at Asan Medical Center on the 14th floor at 11:47 in the morning, in the presence of both his parents and a cardiologist named Dr. Han, whose voice, when he spoke the sentence that had to be spoken, did not tremble and did not rise. That is the sentence. There is no other way to say it. They buried him in a small plot in Gapyeong, with a stone that carried both names and a single date. And Kim, who had never in his life failed to walk into a room he had been asked to walk into, did not walk into the 9th day right. He went instead to the Signiel apartment and drank for 3 days and did not answer the phone. And when he came back, Adayeze was sitting at the kitchen table in the Pyeongchang-dong house, with her forensic files open in front of her and her hands folded on top of them. And she had said quietly that grief could be a room you lived in together or a room you lived in alone, and that she had already chosen, and that she was giving him the chance to choose too. He had said something then that he would spend 9 years not being able to remember exactly, but which had involved the words, your people and my mother, and the word enough. And Adayeze had listened to him without moving, and when he had finished, she had said only in the Korean she had learned from his halmioni that a man who blames a woman for the shape of his own grief has already left the house, and that she would save him the trouble of packing. She had left the following morning with 2 suitcases and the silver compass, which he had given her on their wedding night, with the promise that it would always point them toward one another, and which she had taken because she believed, still, on the morning she left, that a promise made in front of a dying grandmother was a promise a man could one day remember. That was the second quotable line, and she had spoken it in a kitchen in Pyeongchang-dong at 7:34 a.m. on a Wednesday in January, and Kim had not answered it because there was no answer, because she had been right. He had heard, over the following years, in the way a man hears things from a great distance, that she had moved to a coastal town in South Jeolla, that she had taken a job with a small municipal welfare office, that she was quietly known in 3 provinces as the woman who found homes for children no agency wanted. He had not written. He had not called. He had told himself, in the language men of his position have used since the founding of the peninsula, that she would come back when she was ready. She had not come back. She had, instead, been dying. What she had been doing in those years, however, was not only the work of a social worker in a coastal town. Adaeze Okonkwo Kim had, in the 3rd year of her separation, opened a forensic file on the Seongjin Group's Singaporean holding vehicle, and she had continued to open it, quietly, on nights when the children she had begun to gather around her were asleep, for 6 years and 4 months. She had traced 4,300,000,000 won in port concession fees routed through a shell entity in Labuan to a numbered account in Zurich, and from there to a private trust registered in the Caymans in the name of a Korean citizen whose passport had been issued in 2009 at the consulate in Vladivostok. She had cross-referenced the trust's signatories against the guest list of Kim's own engagement dinner at the Shilla in the spring of the previous year, and she had found the name of Kim's cousin Yoon Tae-hyun, whom the family called Tae-huna, in the affectionate diminutive reserved for men who had grown up in the same courtyard, appearing as a beneficial owner on a document dated 3 days before Kim's Halmione's funeral. She had documented the transfer of a 41% stake in the Jeju resort development to a Singaporean nominee whose beneficial owner, on the 3rd layer of the corporate onion, resolved to the same cousin. She had, in the 7th month of her illness, when she already knew what the pathologist at the Gwangju branch of Severance had told her about the mass in her pancreas, compiled the entire dossier into a single leather folio, and she had left it in the care of a lawyer in Mokpo with instructions that it be delivered to a specific prosecutor in the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's Office on the day after her death. She had not sent it to Kim. She had sent it, instead, to a woman named Prosecutor Han Yu Rim, who had been, 18 years ago, a first-year law student in Seoul, when Adaise's older sister, a sister Kim had never met, a sister Kim had not known existed, had died in a hit-and-run on a street in Udaewon that had been ruled by a court that was not honest to be the fault of the pedestrian. Prosecutor Han had been the sister's roommate. Prosecutor Han had, in the 18 years since, become the person in the Republic of Korea most likely to sign an indictment against a chaebol scion. And she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for exactly this folio. 3 people had died to keep the file from reaching her. A junior accountant at the Labuan Shell had drowned in a hotel bathtub in Kota Kinabalu in the previous March, and the coroner had noted, in a single line of a report that no one had read, that the water in the lungs did not match the water in the tub. A courier in Singapore had been struck by a scooter in the Tiong Bahru market in June, and the driver had never been found. A retired auditor in Jeju had been found at the foot of the cliffs at Seopjikoji in September, and his shoes had been placed neatly at the top, and the note had been typed rather than written by hand. Adaeze had known all 3 of them by name. She had, in her last letter to the lawyer in Mokpo, written that she was ready to be the 4th, but that the children were not to be told, and that the folio was to move regardless. "They will not need him alive," she had written on the last page, in the small, careful hand she had learned in a mission school in Enugu at the age of 6. "They will need him disgraced, and they will need him childless, and by the time he understands which one they are taking from him first, it will already be gone." Back in the hall in Pyeongchang-dong, at 12:41 a.m. on the 15th of November, Kim Sang-hoon read the letter Adaeze had left for him. which the girl Chiamaka Ha-un had carried, folded inside the silk that had wrapped the compass, and set it down on the low table beside the untouched bowl of anchovy broth the housekeeper had woken to prepare. The letter was 2 pages long. The paper was the plain-lined stationery of a municipal welfare office. He read it twice. He read the first line 3 times. If you are reading this, it means I never got the chance to forgive you in person. He asked the girl, quietly, whether her mother had suffered. The girl said that her mother had not, and that she had died in a small room in the coastal house with the window open to the sea, and that she had asked, at the end, only for a cup of masil cha and for the youngest to hold her hand. He asked whether her mother had spoken of him. The girl said that her mother had spoken of him every year, on the boys' birthdays and on hers, and that her mother had told them, always, the same thing. She said the girl, that love should never become hatred just because it changes. That was the 3rd quotable line, and it was spoken by a 16-year-old girl on a bench beneath a grandfather clock at 12:44 a.m. And Kim, who had spent 9 years learning not to weep in front of subordinates, learned in a single second that a child was not a subordinate. He did not weep. He sat very still. He asked her then the question he had been afraid to ask since the door had opened. He asked her what her mother had wanted him to do. The girl reached again into the backpack. She drew out a second envelope, smaller than the first, sealed with a piece of tape that had been pressed down by a thumb that had already begun to lose its strength, and she placed it on the table beside the letter. She did not open it. She said, "Our mother said that you would understand what she wanted, and that she did not come back for the man who left her at that kitchen table in January, and she did not come back for the man who signed the papers in Singapore, and she did not come back for the man who wore the navy overcoat to her sister's grave without knowing whose grave it was. She came back for the boy who sat with his halmioni on the pine floor in Yangpyeong the winter he was 7, and for the man that boy might still, at 41, choose to become." That was the 4th quotable line, and it ran to 50 words, and it was spoken by a girl who had walked 11 kilometers in the rain to deliver it. And when she had finished speaking, she folded her hands in her lap and looked at the 2 boys on either side of her to make sure they were still breathing. And Kim understood at last why his mother had warned him 3 times. At 9:47 a.m. on the 16th of November, in a conference room on the 41st floor of the Seongjin Group's headquarters in Gwanghwamun, Kim Sang-hoon walked in alone. He carried a single leather folio. He wore the same navy overcoat he had worn to Adaise's sister's grave, which he had visited that morning at dawn in Itaewon for the first time in his life. 11 men were seated around the long walnut table. His cousin, Yoon Tae-hyun, sat at the seat nearest the window, in the light. Kim did not sit. He placed on the table, one at a time, the following objects: a printed record of a wire transfer of 4,300,000,000, one from a Singaporean holding vehicle to a numbered account in Zurich, dated the 12th of March, a USB drive containing the beneficial ownership disclosures of a Cayman's trust, notarized by a solicitor in Georgetown on the 3rd of April. A copy of a coroner's report from Kota Kinabalu, dated the 14th of March, with a single line highlighted in yellow. A copy of Court Order 2025-Hyung-Sang-1147, signed the previous evening by Prosecutor Han Yu-rim, authorizing the freezing of 41 accounts across 3 jurisdictions. And last, a photograph in a plain wooden frame of an 11-month-old boy in a cot in a farmhouse in Yangpyeong, with a wooden tag above him bearing 2 names. He did not raise his voice. He never did. He looked at his cousin. He said, "Tae-hoon-ah." He said only that. He waited. His cousin did not answer. The silence lasted for 1 minute and 41 seconds, and every man in the room heard it. And it was longer than any speech any of them had ever given. And that was the fifth quotable line. And it was not a line at all, but the absence of one. And it was the loudest thing that had ever happened in that building. Kim gathered the objects back into the folio in the order he had laid them down. He walked to the door. He paused. He said, without turning, that the ninth-floor auditors would find the rest of it by Friday, and that the family would not attend the press conference, and that anyone who wished to remain in the room after he closed the door would do so as a private citizen. He closed the door. He did not slam it. He never did. He did not attend the press conference. He did not attend the arraignment, which was held on the 23rd of November, at which his cousin, who had been the ring-bearer at his wedding 14 years earlier, entered a plea through counsel and did not look up. He went instead, that morning, to the small plot in Gapyeong where his son was buried, and he sat on the cold ground beside the stone for 41 minutes without speaking. And when he stood, the knees of his trousers were wet through, and he did not brush them off. He went from there to the Yangpyeong farmhouse, and he sat on the pine floor his Halmione had chosen, and he ate a small bowl of doenjang jjigae that the housekeeper had driven up from Pyeongchang-dong to prepare. And he understood, for the first time in 9 years, that his Halmione had chosen the pine because pine, when it is properly seasoned, does not warp under the weight of what is placed on it. He began, in the following weeks, a slow, week-by-week courtship of a forgiveness he could not receive from the woman who had earned the right to withhold it, and which he therefore addressed to the 3 children she had left in his hall. He drove to the coastal town in South Jeolla on a Saturday in the first week of December, and he did not enter the small house that overlooked the sea, and he left instead, on the wooden step, a covered dish of doenjang his own mother had made in Seongbuk-dong, wrapped in the white cotton cloth that had held the compass. He drove back the following Saturday and left a small basket of pears from the orchard in Gapyeong. The Saturday after that, he left a book of poems by Han Kang, with 1 page marked by a slip of white paper. The Saturday after that, a book by Kim Hye-soon. On the 5th Saturday, Chiamaka Ha-eun was standing on the wooden step when he arrived, and she did not smile, and she did not invite him in. But she took the small paper bag from his hand, and she said, in the Korean her mother had taught her, that the boys had begun to sleep through the night again, and that this was because they had begun to believe that the man in the black car was not going to disappear. She said then the terms. She said that she would not call him father. She said that the boys would decide, in their own time, what to call him, and that he was not to ask. She said that the small house by the sea would remain their mother's house, and that they would spend school holidays there, and that they would spend school terms in a wing of the Pyeongchang-dong estate that he would convert, at his own expense, into a proper home for them, and for the 11 other children. The municipal welfare office in the coastal town had been quietly waiting for someone to house. She said, finally, that the wing was not to be named for their mother, because their mother had spent her life refusing to have anything named for her, and that it was to be named instead for the sister he had not known she had. She said, "I will not be your daughter. I will not take your name. I will let you drive us to school in the mornings, and I will let you sit at the table when we eat, and I will let you be, in the way our mother wanted, the man she believed you could still choose to become." That was the 6th quotable line, and it was spoken on a wooden step by the sea at 4:12 p.m. on a Saturday in January. And Kim Sang-hoon, who had signed contracts worth billions without a tremor, put his hands into the pockets of his navy overcoat so that the girl would not see them shake, and said, only, yes. The wing was finished by the following autumn. On the day of the small opening, which was not a ceremony because Chiamaka had forbidden a ceremony, an elderly woman arrived at the gate of the Pyeongchangdong estate in a black taxi from the airport. She was slight and straight-backed, wrapped against the November cold in a wool coat the color of dry earth, and she carried a leather handbag that had been mended once at the strap by a hand that knew what it was doing. She was 73 years old. She had flown that morning from Enugu via Doha, and she had not slept in 29 hours. She was Adaizi's mother. Her name was Ngozi Okonkwo, and Ngozi means blessing, and she had not seen her daughter alive since the winter of the year the boy Chukwuemeka Ji-hoon had died. Chiamaka met her at the gate and knelt on the wet stone and pressed her forehead to the back of her grandmother's hand in the old way, and her grandmother lifted her up and did not let her kneel a second time. Kim stood in the doorway of the mansion and did not come forward until he was summoned. He was summoned. Ngozi Okonkwo walked into the study on the second floor, where the silver compass had been returned to the low table of Korean pine, and she sat down on the cushion Chiamaka placed for her, and she looked at Kim Sang-hoon for a long time without speaking. Then she said, in careful English, that prosecutor Han Yu-rim was the daughter of a woman who had been her own daughter's godmother, and that the verdict 18 years ago in the Itaewon court had been bought by a man whose name was on the third page of the folio Adaizis had left in Mokpo, and that this man was still alive and still on the boards of two of the companies Kim's family owned. She said that Adaiz had known this from the 4th year of her separation, and that she had waited patiently because she had understood that a folio delivered too early is a folio that only breaks a heart, and a folio delivered at the right hour is a folio that founds a house. She said that she had come to ask him for one thing. She reached into the leather handbag. She drew out a folded document. It was a deed, drafted in Seoul, in Korean and English, transferring the small house by the sea in South Jeolla into a trust in the joint names of the 3 children and of a 4th name, Adaize Chinwe Okonkwo Kim, in memoriam, with the trust's charitable purpose being the housing of unaccompanied children in the province of South Jeolla in perpetuity. She placed it on the table. She said, "Sign." Kim opened it. He read the first page. He read the second page. He turned to the third page. He did not read past the third page. He signed. He signed with the pen his Halmione had given him at his university graduation, which he had carried in the inner pocket of every coat he had owned for 23 years, and had used, in that time, to sign contracts he had not read carefully enough, and letters he had not sent, and he understood, as he signed, that the not reading was, this time, the gift. That was the 7th quotable line, and it was not spoken. It was the small, dry sound of a pen on paper at 11:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in November. Ngozi Okonkwo took the deed back. She folded it. She placed it in the handbag. She stood. She turned to leave. At the door of the study, she paused. She looked at the wall behind the low pine table, where a photograph had been hung the previous week in a plain frame of unvarnished wood. It was a photograph of Adaiz at 29, in a white blouse and a navy skirt, standing in the doorway of the 8th floor office in Yeoksamdong in the autumn she had first met him. Beneath the photograph, in 3 lines, was a caption in Hangul, in Latin script, and in the Igbo of the mission school in Enugu. It read, Adaize Chinwe Okonkwo Kim. She came home by a longer road, 1979 to 2025. A man closes a door on a woman and calls it the end of a story. A better man, 41 minutes and 9 years later, opens the same door for her children and understands that she had been writing the story the whole time. In a hand, he had not yet learned to read. If you sat with any part of this, do one thing for me before you go. Tell me, in the comments, what door you closed once that you would open now if you could, and who is standing on the other side of it in your memory tonight. Then, if you believe, as we do at Korean Mafia Family, that the quiet stories are the ones that last, subscribe, and tap the bell, and stay with us for the next chapter. There is another house, in another neighborhood, on another rainy night. There is another woman who was underestimated. There is another compass. We will be waiting for you at the door.